Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for my brief sample playthrough of a game of Dreadnoughts Fortresses of Steel. So what I've done is, just to keep this one fairly quick really and try to show you as much as I can of the game system while it's in play, is I've taken two of the antagonists from the famous Battle of Tsushima, none other than HIJMS Mikasa, the flagship of the Japanese fleet, and the Kniaz Suvorov, the Russian flagship, Rozhdestvensky's ill-fated command. And I've just randomly hoiked them out of their parent fleets and formations and paired them off in a one-on-one against each other. So don't ask what bizarre historical circumstances may have led to this, but I think it's nice because you've got two contemporary ships, the finest in their respective navies, and it's a good opportunity to show the sort of quick pick-up battle that this game is capable of. So I've just set up, and I'll just do a quick run-through to explain what everything is. You remember the ship cards from my previous video. I've pretty much covered the geography of the cards, but I will touch on them as it becomes relevant over the course of play. Now, each ship has the ability to start with a formation card. Now, the reason for that is they both have a senior officer in command. So while it may seem odd that a formation card is played on a lone ship, think of it as the greater situational awareness and the command and control that comes with having a senior officer of that caliber in charge. And it's an important bonus because it gives you a +2 to your hand size, which brings me nicely to hand size. Both ships are entitled to 6 cards in their hand, and the reason for that is each player is inherently entitled to 3 cards. You then get 1 more card for each ship in your force as long as it's not crippled or severely damaged in other ways. And lastly, you get the +2 bonus if you have a formation card and an admiral commanding. So 6 cards altogether. The only things that I've placed on the ship cards at the start of the game are the relative range markers, which both start at 0. A little coloured marker to denote the ship's identity. Now, this is not important in a ship-on-ship action, but it's a good habit to get into because when you have forces of 2 or more ships per side, each one is colour-coded so that the ship that is targeting them is able to keep track of how effective their fire is when they're straddling the enemy ship. So at the moment, neither the Mikasa nor the Kniaz Suvorov have any straddle level on each other, but as play progresses, they will attempt to range their main battery in. The counter up here is the crew quality counter. So what I did in generating this scenario is I randomly drew, following the instructions in the rulebook for crew quality. Now, this is random to a large degree, but it's also tweaked for historical realities. So the Japanese, who enjoyed pretty crack crews in 1904, 1905, get a +2 modifier to their draw, whereas the poor Russians, particularly those in the 2nd Pacific Squadron, get a bit of a negative modifier, a -2 in this case. Now, as things happened, you draw for the admiral and for the crew. The 2 admirals topped out at seasoned, which I quite like, actually. I mean, Togo had obviously built up a lot more combat experience than Rozhdestvensky by this point, quite a bit more, really. But it's nice that there's a bit of balance there. The crews turned out very differently. The Russians have a P for poor, which is rather unfortunate. It does mean that well, in this case, the context could well be the degradation and the effect of the long voyage around the world and the subsequent demoralization by the time they even get to Tsushima accounts for that. Whereas the Japanese crew is V for veteran, and that gives them some gunnery bonuses, and they also get small assists in other areas of running the ship. That counter there, the one prefixed T, is the torpedo loadout. So the Kniaz Suvorov only had the two 15-inch torpedo tubes, and they weren't that well sighted in her hull, so she only really gets the one chance. Mikasa had a slightly better arrangement with her torpedo tubes. Not amazing, but better. But she's got 3 shots in this battle with the excellent 18-inch torpedo tubes, which incidentally, those weapons outrange their Russian counterparts. That's more bad news for the Russians. And of course, over here we have the maneuver advantage track. I also drew randomly for the sea state, but modified it for the latitudes of Tsushima. And luckily for both combatants, although the loser might argue this, they got Sea State 1, which is really quite nice. Visibility is extreme, so perfect day, but there is one fog card which has been shuffled into the deck. Again, I like this mechanism. You know there's a bit of bad weather in the offing, but you don't know quite when it's going to appear. So, to begin play, I'm just going to shuffle the deck, but while I do that, I can tell you that each turn, a player gives an order to all his ships, if he or she wishes to. Now, if you are in a formation, so if there were 3 or 4 more ships behind the Mikasa and a formation card was in play, they would essentially be a group. And so you could play a maneuver card, and it would affect the entire group. Otherwise, if ships are operating independently, you can play a single card on each of them. Each ship can take only 1 action per turn, and what that means is it can only have 1 card played on it per turn, and that includes firing its main battery. Now, main guns require cards in order to fire, whether that's ranging fire or salvo fire once they've found the range. As ships get closer, they get what's effectively 2 free rounds of additional firing. Now, that's not for their main guns. The first one is for the secondary armament, and the third one is their torpedoes, if they wish to fire them. And then at the end of the turn, you check the state of your fires and your torpedo reloads, and finally, squadron and fleet morale checks, if required, if you've suffered losses. So without any further ado, because I think that's pretty much covered everything, let's launch in. I tossed a coin and the Japanese won the toss, so they get to go first. And looking at their hand, I apologise for the paper cards. This may seem a bit silly. I had put them all in deck protectors, and then I realised that when you train a camera on them, the reflective effect means you can barely see them. So I am going to make do with using these guys, and apologies Rolf and Nick for selling your lovely components short by using ordinary paper, but there we go. So the Japanese have some ranging fire cards. These are useful for getting the range. They have a maneuver card, which is also handy, an evasive action card, another ranging after that other ranging fire card, they have also unluckily drawn the only fog card in the deck. So you can see this has to be played as soon as the player that has it begins a new turn. So the Japanese were dealt it in their starting hand, unfortunately. So they sight the Kniaz Suvorov, and almost immediately a fog rolls in. Maybe God is on the side of the Russians after all. So the fog card is played, but we also need to draw a random number to see what happens with the visibility, because of course we're starting at extreme range to each other. The Japanese draw a 6, which is actually quite fortunate, because what that means is that the visibility for gunnery purposes is long, and that's great. They only need to get to relative range 1 to the Russian ship to be able to begin firing. Although for as long as the fog lasts, there is a -1 random number check penalty to ranged fire, salvo fire, and secondary guns. So I'm going to put the fog card there as a reminder. I say card, you know what I mean. So the Japanese cannot do any firing this turn because of the fog. Luckily, they have a maneuver card, so they're going to use it to close the range. Now, maneuvering does have its risks because, as you can see from the text here, I mean, the good stuff is that the range chit changes. You can either use it to close or open the range, or you can try and move the maneuver advantage in a direction favourable to you. That tends to be worth doing once you've built up some a decent range that you're happy with, let me say, for pouring fire onto the other guy. However, when you conduct a maneuver, you have to declare, even if you're a lone ship, whether you are doing it in line ahead or line abreast. Now, I rationalize this that when you're doing it in line ahead, your maneuvering and your movements are somewhat more deliberate. You're not going straight for him. You're approaching at a more oblique angle in order to keep your guns laid on, which does mean that he has a better chance of stopping you by countering the maneuver. If you come in at line abreast, you're steering your straight for him pretty much, pointing your prow at him and going for it. Now, the risky bit with movement is it always comes with a price. You have to check your formation integrity. And if you fail the random number check, your ship loses its formation card, which can be a significant problem. But the Japanese don't really have any other option. The visibility is not going to be helping them. So they play the maneuver card. I'm just going to have a look at the Russian hand to see whether they can counter this. Ranging fire, salvo fire, no, they're really looking for red cards. They have a spare formation card, which could be handy, but they have nothing to stop the Japanese, so the Mikasa bears in. And she has to, the Russians have not stopped her, so she goes to she goes to range chit 1. So I flip over her range chit from 0 to 1. But now I have to check whether she's managed to keep the formation bonus. So, random number, she's drawn a 2. Now she needs a 3 or better. Luckily, she has a veteran crew, which gives her a +1 bonus for a 3. And unless you declare it, it's assumed you're going in line ahead. So the line abreast penalty does not apply. So the formation card remains, and the Japanese have done pretty well. Obviously, they're too far out of range for secondary battery and torpedo fire, so they just refill their hand to 6 cards. Oh, good, they have another maneuver. Now, you can discard cards if you take no actions at all. So no card play means you can chuck out as many of these as you want and just refill your hand at the end of the turn. It is possible to not play a card for your main battery and still conduct fire from your secondaries or your torpedoes, and that still counts for the purposes of drawing new cards. So in this period, I've probably been dropping very broad hints that it's a good idea to get close because you can bring your weaponry to bear more efficiently. One thing I will say, this game models very well the frustrations of hitting anything at very long range. So over to the Russians. They have the same problem as the Japanese, although the Japanese have effectively solved it for them by coming into long range. So they, looking at their options, they have a lot of salvo fire cards, but they can't use these until they've ranged in properly. So you see, this card with a fire strength of 2 requires a straddle level of 1. So the Kniaz Suvorov would have to have achieved that. So they need to get there first, which means they're going to indulge in some ranging fire. So they prepare to do that. The Japanese can retaliate because ranging fire can be used. Oh wait, no, wrong card, sorry. Oh no, that's straddle level tests. No, they can't actually. Ah, okay, right. No, my initial optimism evaporates as the Russians very deliberately train out. So when it comes to working out the straddle level, that is the procedure over there. So the straddle value is the relative range plus whatever random number you draw, minus any cards the Japanese could play to mitigate it. There are none in this case. And your random number. Now, you also have to, with these modifiers, you have to make sure you go carefully down the table. This becomes second nature after a while, but I'll work through it just so you can see and understand what's happening. So the Russians play their ranging fire card. And going down the modifiers, there's first the gun modifiers. Now, the Russians have a +1. There's probably good guns in a commanding position. So they've already got 1. They don't have a veteran crew, unfortunately. That's secondary gunfire anyway, sorry. I should just say the bold ones are secondary fire and torpedo fire, so they don't have an effect on long range. So the Russians get a +1 bonus for the gun size. They're not yet ranged in, but they do have range finders, so that's a +2. And that's all they get at this distance. So they have +2, and they are going to draw, and they get a 2. Now the target number they needed was the number in the little diamond on Mikasa's card, which in this case is a 5. So unfortunately, having drawn a 2, their firing total is 4, which means their shots are close, but unfortunately not good enough for a straddle. And because of the range considerations, that effectively ends the Russian turn. So they will draw 1 card. I have also just realised that I've forgotten to do something. Fog and squall weather cards are checked every time that a movement card is played. And of course the Japanese just played a movement card, so I am obliged to draw a random number to see whether the fog disappears. I'll do that now, with apologies for doing it out of sequence. On an even number, it remains, but the visibility has to be checked again. A 1. Oh no, the visibility has got worse. So instead of being long range, it's now dropped to close range with some rather hefty penalties for firing. Okay, both vessels are going to have to try very hard to close the range now. So it's a bit of a no-brainer for the Japanese, really. They need to try and get closer. So they're going to repeat their move of the earlier turn by playing a maneuver card. The Russians, I do not believe, can counter this. No, they can't, so they just have to strain their eyes into the fog to see what Mikasa's doing. Mikasa is, of course, closing deliberately line ahead rather than line abreast. So formation integrity check is 2, +1 for her veteran crew makes a 3. She keeps her formation card and draws another. Salvo fire, not that useful at the moment. Also, I will remember to do it this time because she's played another movement card. Oh yes, I must increase her range chit as well. So Mikasa has now moved to range chit 2. Which is medium range. And she drew a 3, which is exactly what the Japanese wanted. Because an odd number removes the fog. So they just did enough steaming to get themselves out of the fog bank, and now they just need to check the visibility. I mean, it's sea state 1, so even on a draw of 0, the visibility has gone back up to extreme range. That's very useful. The only downside for the Japanese is, of course, they spent their turn getting out the fog, and now the Russians can capitalize on it. So the Kniaz Suvorov gleefully lines up another ranging shot. As I recall, the Japanese don't have anything that can really... yeah, it's... oh, actually, no, I lie. They can. That was my mistake. Yes, because they're attempting to increase their straddle level, so the Japanese can, in fact, impose a -1 modifier on it. Apologies, Admiral Togo, I was selling you short back there. So, at medium range, there's no new modifiers. The Russians still haven't ranged in, so they benefit from their rangefinders still, and from their gun bonus. But it's only a +1 now because the Japanese are interfering somehow, or natural circumstances are throwing the Russians off a little bit. You can rationalize that in all sorts of ways. So it's +1, and the Russians get a 6. So that's a total of 7, which, given that the Mikasa's target number is 5, means that the Russians have successfully found the range. That is a very scary development for the Japanese, because they've not managed to do the same yet, and unbeknownst to them, the Russians have quite a few salvo fire cards. So very happy with that. The Suvorov draws a card. Togo's probably incredibly outwardly calm on the Mikasa, but he knows that this is not good. And also, because he used one of his cards to try and blunt the Russians the previous turn, he's a bit short. So he decides, as he's got so many of the things, it's time to do a bit of ranging fire of his own. The Russians decide they're going to play it safe, and even though it's their last ranging fire card, they're going to attempt to stymie the Japanese. So the Japanese guns don't carry a bonus, so they only get the range-finding bonus of +1, which the Russians take away with this card. And with a card draw 4, it's not quite good enough. It was close. Had it been a 5, the Japanese would have ranged in as well. But the first shells have landed pleasingly close, so Togo just needs to build on that. Ah, the other thing I have forgotten is that we're now at medium range. So both ships could in fact play their secondary batteries on each other. I'm going to allow the Russians to do it because they should have been allowed to do it during their turn and I forgot. And then I'll allow Mikasa to do hers. Again, apologies, I've done this out of sequence, but the way these guns work is somewhat different to the main battery guns because they don't need to range in. They can start firing as soon as they have a decent target. And so the way they work is they simply have to score a hit on their target number subject to modifiers. So for the Russian guns, they need to draw a 3 or better. So they open fire, and they get a 7. Ouch, that's good shooting. But there are some modifiers to be had. They have a poor crew, so it's reduced to 6. Mikasa's speed doesn't affect it either way. The sea state is clear, so there's no problem there. So they get a 6, which is a hit. Now the question is, next, where do they hit? Another card is drawn, and it's a flotation hit. So now we check their penetration. There's 2 values here on the card. One is penetration at close range, the other's penetration at medium range. At medium range, the 6-inch guns have a penetration of 3. Now to this is added the results of a random card draw, and the Russians have drawn a 1. So an odd number draw is a +1. So their penetration total is 4. Now that was a flotation hit, so I now consult the Mikasa's flotation row, and next to that F there is an 8 for her armor strength. Now that easily defeats that hit. So the Russians hit the Mikasa fair and square, but the 6-inch shells glance off the side armor. Still not encouraging for the Japanese, but they can give Mikasa a pat and go, "Atta girl, that's the way to do it." And now getting back into the proper turn sequence, again apologies. The Japanese are going to return the favor with their own guns. And unlike the poor Russians, they get they actually get a +1 because their veteran crew are lining up. So here we go. They get a 3, which is also a hit. So like the Russians, because they're very similar guns, their penetration... Oh wait, we'll see where they hit first before we worry about penetration. A possible double hit on the main turret. Now there's going to be a bit optimistic because of course the Suvorov's main turrets are quite heavily armored, but let's see how they do. So the Japanese have a 3. Their penetration draw is an odd number, so that goes up to 4. The main turret armor rating for the Suvorov is a 6. So the Japanese return the favor. Their lighter caliber shells slam into one of the Suvorov's turrets, but again, they bounce off the thick hide. Now, looking at torpedoes, torpedoes are, generally speaking, a close-range weapon, but the Japanese torpedoes are rated for medium. They have a very high chance of hitting at close range, but they can take a shot into the brown at medium range, so they're going to do that. So I reduce the number of torpedoes available from 3 to 2, and the Japanese draw. They need a 7 or better in this case because of the distance. So they've got a 4, but what about the modifiers? The same modifiers apply to torpedoes as apply to secondary gunfire. So the veteran crew makes it a 5. None of these other modifiers apply. And note, the torpedo has missed. It was worth trying a shot, but unfortunately, no dice that time. So the Japanese end their turn with that. And, oh yes, I've already drawn the card for them. Oh, that's right, yes. The Russians had tried to stop them. Okay, it is the Russian turn, if I've not totally confused myself by this point. So, the Russians, having managed to get a straddle level 1 on the Mikasa, can now start hitting her with salvo fire, which is not a pleasant thought for the Japanese. So they are going to open up. Togo quickly riffles through his hand to see whether he's got anything that he does. The Mikasa is going to take evasive action. So the strength of the Russian salvo fire card is 2. The Japanese evasive card is going to reduce it to 0. And now we get to add the other factors in. So the relative range is 2. The Russians get a bonus for their heavy guns, which is a further +1, bringing it up to 3. They are ranged in, that's 4. And that's it. So they've got a strength of 4. Not too bad. Let's see where they hit. Sorry, that's their accuracy rather than their strength. So the random number is 3. That gives them a... Oh no, silly me. I'd drawn their random number to begin with. So it's... No, I hadn't. Sorry. Going mad, going mad. So the total is 7 altogether. And consulting the salvo fire value, a 7's higher than the 6, which is the target number you need to get in order to score your hit. So the Suvorov's heavy shells have just struck the Mikasa. Not good. So now we see where they hit. Steering gear or ram, okay. Which one of the two? Going to draw for it. Odds of 1 is steering gear. Odds are steering gear, evens are ram. And it's a 6, so the ship's ram has been hit. Now the penetration value of the Suvorov's guns at this range are 8, which is quite hefty. And I'll just check the bonus. She's drawn an even number, which is a +2, so the full attack strength is 10, which is a very hefty hit. The armor on the Mikasa's ram is only 3, so she takes bow damage, and I'm just going to mark her with a hit marker there. Not a great start for the Japanese. She's not going to be doing any ramming anytime soon with damage like that. And very well pleased with themselves indeed. The Russians fill up their hand. Now note that although they've scored a hit on the strength of their straddle level, the Russians have not increased it. So the act of hitting and damaging based on your straddle level does not automatically bring it up. That has to be achieved by further ranging fire shots. So there we go, we're a few turns in, and interestingly, despite their inherent disadvantages by weaker crew and all the rest of it, I was incidentally also playing the Russians, although I didn't mention it, with slightly weaker armour. That was brought about by the overloading, which reduced the effectiveness of the Borodino class's armour belt at Tsushima. So not only are they holding their own pretty well, but they've drawn first blood. Actually, funnily enough, much like they did historically. But it would be interesting to see how this fight develops. But I'm going to leave it there because I think that's given you a bit of a flavour for how the game works. The Russians would, of course, have followed on with more secondary fire, although I doubt it would have been very effective at this range. But they would have held on to their torpedo because they've only got the one shot with it. And it's the kind of thing they want to reserve for close range. So I hope you found that demonstration of this marvellous game interesting, and I hope it's given you some idea of why I enjoy it so much. It's really immersive. It gives you a good sense of what it's like to be driving, well, I should say commanding a pre-Dreadnought battleship in action. If you would like a more complete playthrough or perhaps a more historical scenario, please let me know in the comments and I shall add it very happily to my to-do list. But for now, I'll just say thank you very much for following the series on this marvellous, marvellous game. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've had making it, as much fun as I've had making it. And I look forward to seeing you all again when I make a video summing up my conclusions about this title and what I think of it on the strength of the plays I've been able to put in. So thank you very much for joining me. Your company is always appreciated. Whether you're one of my veterans, a huge hello guys, or a newcomer to the channel, I really look forward to seeing you in the next one. And thank you so much for joining me in this one. Bye.